Okay, hello. Today we are going to read chapter 4 out of Never Again Still Means Never Again. The title of chapter 4 is Mein Kampf. The quote on the top of the page, quote, anyone who does not wish to be the hammer in history will be the anvil, unquote, by the asshole Hitler. All right, I did something that I thought I would never do. I forced myself to read all of Mein Kampf, every single line and lie. Now, taking aside my personal prejudices about Hitler, this was by far the worst book I have ever had the displeasure of reading. I don't think anyone has ever said it's an easy read. It's just horrific. I thought it would take me like a few days, but it was so bad that I think overall it took me, including massive bathroom breaks, 2 or 3 weeks. Hitler mentions early on in Mein Kampf that he prides himself on his, quote, oratory skills, unquote. He used those skills to charm, dazzle, and control members of his party and eventually all of Germany. Anyway, it highlights something Hitler was good at: persuasion, like all good mass murdering cult leaders are. In his first chapter, he talks a bit about his family. I wasn't surprised that it included self indulgent babbling about himself and the need for his father's approval. The relationship Hitler had with his father was usually contentious and cantankerous, but he tried to work it out amicably through conversations and an understanding of their opposite views. Boy, that changed. Hitler came a long way from those discussions to 1933 when opposing Hitler's views meant death. Dissension, defiant opinions, tough luck. The outcome was death. Okay, so far I've read all the drama between Hitler and his dad that could bore a bullfrog to sleep until I came across this little nugget. Quote, my lungs became seriously affected that the doctors advised my mother very strongly, not in any circumstances, to allow me to take up a career which would necessitate working in an office. He ordered that I should give up attending the real school for at least a year, unquote. What? I honestly, when I read that, I fell over laughing. Has anyone besides him ever been doctor banned from working in an office? I think he was lazy and just wanted to dabble in art. He complained and whined incessantly about not being accepted to the School of Painting, but then he claimed he was an unknown genius in architecture. I wonder if his professors would be concerned about how Hitler's lungs would stand up in their architectural classes. No matter, he didn't get into architectural school anyways. The self grandiosity and self adulation in this chapter are impressive. You would think he wrote the original film in 1911, The Count of Monte Cristo, and themed it after himself. I mean, how Hitler pulled himself up by his bootstraps is inspiring. If you're a naive, gullible twit who enjoys fairy tales, Star Wars is more believable than his book. Remember, you must put Mein Kampf in context. Hitler was in jail and 35 to 36 years old when writing this horrible book on his thoughts and doings in the context of himself and his teen years as he goes through his upbringing to modern times of his writing age. Hitler was 17 years old in retrospect and didn't once bring up girls or hanging out with other young adults, but he found the time and fortitude to concern himself with social democracy, the social democratic government, German indoctrination, blah, 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 at 17 years old. Right. Where I grew up, we call that at minimum crap, or an easier word, a lie. He claimed to have all the answers by age 20 and vowed to cover every topic from eliminating all the Jews in Germany to telling everyone how he invented the freezer. But did he share his brilliant cures for the world's woes with anyone outside his local pub? Nope. Not until 15 years into the future. Being the selfish, psychotic dork that he was, he kept his answers, quote, buried deep inside his underdeveloped frontal lobe and waited for the equivalent of another lifetime, 14 to 15 more years, to write his manifesto from prison. So brilliant, so brave, such foreshadowing, such bullshit. Do you think maybe, possibly, he was lying? Conjuring up more lies? I mean, yes, Herr Liar was definitely a nerd back in the day, but Mein Kampf is filled with anything and everything to try and make himself look good, like a young prodigy or some sort of savant. Hitler's ignorance about the Jews. And here it is, finally, near the bottom of page 63 in Mein Kampf, he writes, quote, knowledge of the Jews is the only key to a true understanding of the inner nature and therefore the real aims of social democracy, unquote. That's right here, moron. Yeah, that's right. Further down, he writes about not knowing any Jews. Quote, I do not remember ever having heard the word at home during my lifetime, unquote. What? So, in the 62 pages of this rag I read before this, he claimed knowledge of the inner workings and nuances of every party but the Whigs. And he says up until that point that he'd never heard the word Jew. Seriously? He constantly talks about the Jews controlling this party and that party, and then he said that. Was his self esteem that low? I say that because it's so obvious he always sought any means to make himself look smarter, more insightful, and ahead of everyone else. Kind of a inner braggadocio, to help offset his real insecurities. Jews at that time were about 10% of the population in Austria. Jews excelled at being tailors and working in mills, factories, and farms, areas where a young Hitler would obviously have come in contact. Yet, he actually wrote that he had no idea about Jews until his teenage years. Well, except for the one Jew in his school, which he's probably lying about. His audacity is staggering. At this point, if you put Mein Kampf in the fiction section, a fiction section would ask how Hitler had never heard of a Jew before. So this idiot was a subject matter expert on the Jews, except he had never met a Jew. Are you getting the picture? Hitler was the emperor of tall tales and whoppers. It's so easy to catch him in his own lies. It's finding the truth that becomes impossible. The genius. Quote, genius is a will-o-wisp if it lacks a solid foundation of perseverance and fanatical tenacity. This is the most important thing in all of human life. End quote. Notice how Hitler kind of told on himself in this quote. He believed that fanatical tenacity was the most important thing in life. Yes, he was pathetically, hopelessly, and fanatically mind locked on an agenda and legacy of annihilation and supremacy. Imagine living with such a high opinion of yourself. If there was a narcissistic convention, Hitler would be sitting in every seat. The advent of the Austrian Jews, of which some were involved in Zionism, was what pushed Hitler over the edge and into anti Semitism. Now that he'd awoke, everything Jew was bad in his mind. Everything. Jewish achievements in the press, in art, in literature, and in the theater were never acceptable. There were a lot of very successful Jewish bankers and business owners who contributed immensely to both Austrian and German societies. However, Hitler felt they should no longer be involved. I said felt because he had no idea about banking or running a business. That psycho couldn't run a pay toilet, yet he espoused condemnation that he was completely clueless about. Hitler stated, quote, when the state is composed of a homogeneous population, the natural inertia of the latter and the powers of the resistance derived from the inertia will preserve it from internal collapse during an astonishingly long periods of misgovernment and maladministration. It may often seem as if the life had died out of such a body political. But the time comes when the apparent corpse rises up and gives the rest of the world astonishing proof of its indestructible vitality. Unquote. He must have been a blast to hang out with at parties, yelling, spitting, and screaming at everyone while trying to explain, quote, his struggle, unquote. Since I'm basically reading this book now as a comedy, I knew it wouldn't take long to evoke one small grin. Quote, by far the most effective part in a political education, which is this connection, is best expressed by the word propaganda, unquote. Hitler also stated, quote, the press is the chief means employed in the process of political enlightenment. It represents a kind of fool for adults. This educational activity, however, is not in the heads of the state, but in the clutches of power, which are partly of an inferior character, unquote. So Hitler understood the power of the media and knew how to exploit it. Quote, the press only a few days to transform some ridiculously trivial matter into an issue of national importance, while vital problems were completely ignored or failed and hidden away from public attention. Unquote. That's what he said. Yeah. Like, was there a law passed in Germany that anyone caught reading Mein Kampf would be arrested? Books, newspapers, radios, and actually instruments of information. Of course, only Hitler knew the real truths as a 20-year-old. If he was just the head of Germany, the gatekeeper of truth, then he would open the press for all citizens, or so he said. Well, in 1933, Hitler finally got the chance. How do you think it went? Book burnings and propaganda. On May 10th, 1933, a nationwide book burning ceremony occurred in 34 university towns and cities. Anything deemed, quote, un-German, unquote, or non-approved literature by these cultural geniuses became illegal. On that date, the largest book burning ceremony was in Berlin, with an estimated 40,000 people who burned around 25,000 books. I mean, I get that once the Nazis took over, they eliminated the word fun, but 40,000 people showing up to participate in a book burning ceremony? I mean, my gosh, this is early into Hitler's reign and before he started scaring the crap out of every young adult in Germany. I mean, 40,000 in one evening to burn books. I always imagined back then the guys were at the bars playing various Waldizers, German plucked instrument, while German women with blonde pigtails and wearing dirndl skirts were serving massive beers. You know, a party at the pub where everyone is singing and laughing. Nah, let's go with book burning. What other examples could you possibly need about never, ever, ever living or moving to a totalitarian state? I mean, he added a minister of propaganda just days after taking over in 1933. Who gives someone the title of propaganda minister in a government? Furthermore, he picked someone who was almost insane as himself. Again, just spitballing here, but do you think Goebbels kept a list for Hitler of the number of people who killed themselves after reading Mein Kampf? All right, hold up, just hold up. Here's Herr Nitwit. Quote, during the boisterous years of my youth, nothing used to dampen my wild spirits so much as to think I was born at a time when the world had manifestly decided not to erect any more temples of fame except in honor of business people and government officials. End quote. Okay. I mean, how many times do I have to tell the Jew haters that Hitler, the cretin, had no friends? None. He didn't have one as an adolescent. He didn't have one as a teenager, in his early 20s, 30s, 40s, or after he died. None. So, statues in honor of business people and government officials were the biggest thing to dampen the wild spirits of his youth. And during the boisterous years, too. Wow. Censorship. On page 54 of Mein Liar, Hitler goes off on a mean spirited rant about newspapers spreading lies and journalistic integrity coming from him. Why am I laughing? From the word go, Hitler did nothing but spread propaganda, bar journalists, and eliminate public radio, really like a week after he was made chancellor. His actions, as opposed to what he writes, are not even in the same stratosphere. The do as I say, not as I do is very typical for sociopaths, so it's not surprising, but it just becomes harder and harder to read because we all know the outcomes of his lies in the future, to read because we all know the outcome of his lies as to what he wrote and said. It took a little time after he became chancellor, but from 1933 until his death, Herr Propaganda controlled 100% of all news, entertainment, opera, radio, whatever. Yet, there he was going nuts that one paper dared to go against his narrative. He was going to pass a law allowing him to marry himself. However, as hard as he tried, he couldn't find a way to consummate. Oh, and to my female friends, I'd like to hear your thoughts on page 55 in Mein Misogynist. Thanks. Military career. Now, Hitler finally had his biggest wish come true. He joined the army. Of course, early on, he almost fell into a deep depression thinking he would be sent to the front lines and might miss the war. Can you imagine the other guys in his unit? Hitler in the corner of their barracks crying uncontrollably because he wasn't on the front lines, while the rest of the unit fought each other for umbrellas to keep his spit off of them. Hitler, so brave, so noble. Anyway, he got his wish and was finally sent to the front. Well, the bullets started flying and soldiers got shot, and he wrote, quote, while death began to make havoc in our ranks, we passed along the song unto those beside us. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt, unquote. Now, I've never been in a war, but those of you who have, please let me know if singing patriotic songs as a unit while on the front line is common. At this point, he immediately explained how difficult war was, how he and his unit had been in a lot of battles, and how war was so much more difficult over time that even he, yes, Hitler, struggled. Yet, somehow, some way, he quickly conquered any personal doubts and responded like a Batman movie. Quote, the stronger did resistance become, until finally the internal strife was over and the call of duty was triumphant. Herr Frontline Singer paused his military-induced internal strife to conquer a diatribe, how the press was lying, how Jews and Marxism were to blame for this conflict, and he, while going through his first mustache phase, knew all the answers. How many thousands of examples have I highlighted when he says something like, quote, the reason for this problem for Germans and Austrians is because of the Jewish ... end of quote. But rarely, if ever, does he give examples. In 1919, in Germany, there were around 500,000 Jews, and overall, these Jews were middle class. In 1919, 500,000 Jews in Germany equaled less than 0.09% of the total population. So, this 0.09%, under 1%, was the reason for World War I. Did that 0.09% cause a munitions crisis for Germany? Did it cause Germany to be underfunded during the war? Because whichever political party at the time, which was the Socialist Democratic Party, won the most seats, also won the parliament and controlled the overall government. It's the Jews' fault. Anyway, Herr Bonehead almost, I mean, it was like really close, but almost went 4 paragraphs without bringing up something, anything about a Jew. And then wham, quote, Eisner's death, Kurt Eisner, the politician, served only to hasten this development and finally led to the dictatorships of the councils, or to put it more correctly, to a Jewish hegemony, which turned out to be a transitory, but which was the original name of those who contrived the revolution. End of quote, by the way. What appears to be such an innocuous statement is a prime example of him lying, peeing on himself, and watching his evil grin turn into an evil smile, assuming his comments were profound and accurate. They weren't. He did this all the time, and anti Semites just lapped it up. He starts by mentioning the death of Kurt Eisner, who was the head of the leading party in Germany, the USPD party. Eisner was shot and killed on February 21st, 1919, while on his way to present his resignation to the Bavarian parliament. By my watch, this puts the party's reign around 100 days. Quote, Eisner's death served only to hasten this development of a revolution. Unquote, Hitler claimed. Lie. It's a lie. It's just nonsense. It's a blatant lie. Again, he's making up stuff. In January 1919, more than 1 month before February, for any simpletons reading this, Eisner's USPD party had been soundly defeated in the elections for both the National Assembly and the Bavarian Landtag, coming in sixth place with 3% of the vote. Eisner's death led to about 2 months worth of violence and finally to the dictatorship of the council. From November 1918 to January 1919, Germany was governed by the, quote, councils of the people's deputies, unquote, under the leadership of Friedrich Ebert, who was the leader of the MSPD party, and Hugo Haas of the USPD party, and Jewish. This whole thing was set up as a provisional cabinet of ministers. This coalition enjoyed mass support among the workers, councils, and people numbering in the millions or so in various political parties in Germany. Hitler, of course, the pragmatist, intellectual, for the working man kind of guy, shows some fortitude by mocking and dismissing the following laws that were implemented by Ebert and Haas. All of these passed. I'm going to give a few examples that Hitler absolutely hated. Number 1, the 8-hour workday. 2, domestic labor reform. 3, work councils. 4, agricultural labor reform. 5, right of civil service associates. 6, local municipality social welfare reliefs, split between the Reich and the states, and national health insurance. 7, reinstatement of demobilized workers. 8, protection from arbitrary dismissal with appeals as a right. 9, regulated wage agreement. 10, universal suffrage from 20 years of age in all types of elections, and local and national. 11, female and child workers entitled to a 15-minute break if they work between 4 to 6 hours, and 30 minutes between 6 to 8 hours, and also 1 hour extra for longer days. 12, committees composed of the workers of representatives in their relationship with employers to safeguard the rights of workers. 13, the right to bargain collectively. 14, election of workers on committees. And 15, establishment of reconciliation committees. Hitler hated this, all of it. Quote, no one contrived a revolution, end quote. He said, look at those 15 resolutions that I just went over, and I defy one of you to disagree. For those of you in hate groups, your hero, your champion, and your leader hated every one of those laws, supporting everyday workers. What are you people thinking, chasing after this loon? Here are a few reasons why I think he hated him. He had to be the one in control and the center of attention. In the first 7 chapters of Mein Kampf, he doesn't shut up about socialism and socialists, etc. Then Ebert and Haas rolled out socialist types of laws for the ordinary folks in a little over 2 months, and everyone agreed they, quote, nailed it, unquote. With the overriding mental capacity of one of your Doc Martin boots, I think Hitler disagreed because the former head of the party, Eisner, and current party leader Haas were both Jews. Even though there weren't many Jewish politicians, Hitler's anti Semitism always overrode his sensibilities. I'll just never understand how anyone could believe anything that came out of his mouth. I mean, outside of neo Nazis, and remember, Hitler would have sued your group for using the word Nazi. Showing up at his rallies, Hitler wouldn't have spit in your mouth if you were dying of thirst, unless you could help him in power. He was a witless, asocial coward. Mein Kampf is just so far fetched with a litany of lies, untruths, and complete mischaracterizations, and a void of facts. This was the first time it really dawned on me that this horrible fiction writing led to so much death and suffering. It led to the systematic murder of my people, our people, and for what? A terrible book with horrific ideologies written by a madman who somehow convinced millions of people he was their answer. Hofbrauhaus Festival. Hitler's 25-point thesis, the program of his new party, was introduced at the Hofbrauhaus Festival in Munich to an enthusiastic crowd of nearly 2,000. Let's go over some of these points, shall we? Hitler rambled on about all the new changes to be implemented once the Nazis took over. This wasn't just your typical, quote, this is what you will get if you support the Nazi party, unquote. No, he went all in by telling supporters, quote, you'll get everything, unquote. Well, darn. The men must have thought, sign us up. And just to confirm, you're saying if we vote to get your party elected to run the government, we will get everything we want, nothing for the women, right? End quote. That must be the greatest campaign promise ever. Hitler didn't have to say or utter another word. Drop the mic, walk off, get in his new car, and drive over to his new palace. Throughout Mein Kampf, Herr, give you everything you want, is constantly bashing and bemoaning countless numbers of lies that were spewed by his opponents. Yet in one campaign promise, he exceeded them all with that whopper. Let's continue with this paragraph. Quote, the farmer is assured that the interest of agriculture will be safeguarded. Lie. And the industrialist is assured of protection for his products. Lie. And the consumer is assured that his interests will be protected in regards to market pricing, whatever that means. Anyway, Germany entered World War I in 1914 as a substantial importer of food and fodder. Blockades and trade embargoes exacerbated shortages. By the end of the war in 1918, Germany's urban population was starving, and 763,000 people were estimated to have died from malnutrition, and the incidence of many serious diseases increased. The Nazis had a bunch of brilliant plans to help feed their citizens. Basically, in each country it invaded, German farmers would be brought in to work the land and send the products back to Germany. Then they came up with the hunger plan. Talk about a great idea. This is where after Germany took over Ukraine and its phenomenal soil, it would severely expedite grains, mainly wheat and oil seeds, back to Germany. However, there is a downside, still a positive side for the Nazis, but the downside is when the Germans were planning the hunger plan, they estimated the starvation of between 20 to 30 million deaths by starvation. Look, if the Germans, Nazis are happy, I guess I don't see a problem, right? Which part of Hitler's psychotic and evil do today's hate groups admire the most? Are you okay with 20 to 30 million deaths via starvation, including millions of children? This is the Nazi party. This is your party. Anyway, the comments of farmers assured the interest of his agriculture initiatives, the industrialists ensured the protection of his products, and the consumer interest would be protected in regards to market pricing. in prices. But this was, per usual, lies, 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 sprinkled in with a lot of lies. And if you were a farmer, you were drafted and slave labor took over your farm. If you were an industrialist, the state either took over your business or forced your company to manufacture anything geared towards the war effort. Unless, of course, you could write Hitler a check every month, then neither of those first two applied to you. However, you, the industrialist, will set the market price. The consumer is always pays market price. But Herr Dummy, the consumer, ain't setting any price in Nazi Germany. Was there anything Hitler promised that actually happened? Even in his retrospect writing, this book at age 36, can you think of one? The Volkisch movement. According to historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Volkisch referred to a national collectivity inspired by a common creative energy, feelings, and sense of individuality. These metaphysical qualities were supposed to define the unique cultural essence of the German people. Unquote. This is the same logic as trying to unite the country under a song. You can't be talked into focus. Hitler spit all over the last 10 pages of this nonsense when he could have said something profound like, quote, well, when you're outside walking, remember, other Germans have walked too, so unite by walking, end quote. He's an idiot. Weltanschauung. This is simply a person's philosophical belief. The worst thing in the world for people like Hitler is for others to have their own beliefs. In his mind, there was no need for it. He dictated what those beliefs should be, and there was no need to provide a counterargument. If your beliefs were exactly like his, then your beliefs were correct. Kind of makes it easier if you think about it, right? In essence, if you're currently in an anti Semitic, racist, homophobic, etc. group that has any ties to Hitler or the Nazis, you are telling the world that you have no free thought and you're conformist. Thanks. Makes it easy for us to spot. Marxism. I'm ready to shoot up heroin as Hitler obsesses about Marxism and Jews and Marxism. Once Hitler brought Volkisch and Weltanschauung together, there would be weekly karaoke singing of Kumbaya rotated at everyone's mansions on their 1,000-acre land, which produced rice, shrimp, Cheerios, and scotch. Or it didn't do a thing because they're all just theoretical ideologies. Simply put, it's Hitler's opinion and his alone. Over time, he plainly conned and convinced others that these were facts. Which group do you fall into? If Hitler was alive during the time of Hitler's reign, Hitler would have been sent himself to a concentration camp for the mentally disabled. They would have gotten a couple of months out of him cleaning toilets and sent him to the gas chamber. Mein Kampf is obviously one of, if not the worst books written in the last few hundred years. I mean, there were better books printed before the Gutenberg press than this crap. We can all agree that most of what Hitler writes, by a high majority, is written as though he's talking to himself while informing the world of his brilliance, ideas, resolve, and so much more. This book is fiction, as I've said over and over. If you had someone read Mein Kampf who knew nothing about Hitler and asked him to compare it to how Germany was governed from 1938 to 1945, the reader would have told you whoever was in power never, no way, no how, wrote Mein Kampf. I'm guessing early into his reign as German Chancellor, Hitler probably wished he had never wrote it too, as Herr Lang does almost zero of what he typed, and the number of lies is incalculable. I'm not sure there's a sentence that is logically correct in this entire book. Uh, this whole this whole thing is not only filled with a lot of holes, but most of his ridiculous comments are stated as facts when they're clearly not. He talks about the horror of no more Aryans existed in the world. Quote, yet if the Aryan, who is the creator and custodian of civilization, should disappear, all cultural corresponding to the spiritual needs of the superior nations today would also disappear. Yeah, okay, nut job. His whole book, without question, is garbage. He provided almost zero examples when mentioning Jews and their misdeeds throughout the entire book. I didn't realize how stupid and ignorant one must be to think this book has true meaning. I don't care how mentally deficient someone is, to quote even one word of this book lets the world know that you're an idiot. You would also have to be ignorant, naive, extremely impressionable, and probably self loathing to believe anything in the book. You are definitely near or at your end if you try to live by this book. In summary, you have officially given up on being a decent, respectable person. I'm embarrassed and ashamed that any American, even one, would try to further this fool's ideologies. I'm not sure I can vocalize how naive and ignorant one must be to adhere to his words. It's shameful. Well, I finally finished Mein Kampf, which should have been titled Opposite Day. It's truly astounding the number of things Hitler got so wrong. I still find it hilarious that he had the German government buy 6 million copies of this book. Furthermore, how incredibly inaccurate this book is, boring and dishonest. Why anyone, would try and emulate one sentence could only mean they are alone, without pride, and completely lacking any self confidence and critical thinking. What day is it, or have we won yet? On January 30th, 1933, Hitler took over as Chancellor of Germany. Sometime in 1936, Hitler met Dr. Theo Morell, who was called to give Hitler a vitamin injection. Hitler felt like the vitamin injections were working well, so the doctor gave him daily vitamin shots for around 5 years. Sometime in 1941, on a day when Hitler got sick, Dr. Morell gave him a hormone shot and a shot of an opiate. From that day going forward, he became a heavy drug abuser and addict. By 1943, he couldn't stop. Depending on the day, drugs would change, but overall, his favorites were heroin, crystal meth, oxycodone, cocaine, and a few others. Starting in 1943 until his death, he was a raging, full blown addict. We're not talking just in the morning or in the evening. He used any time he was awake. Shame he couldn't have made it to the 1980s, as I'm sure he would have loved crack. It is impressive how he could single handedly run a war and continue to convince his extremely gullible nation, arguably the most gullible in world history, of his successes while maintaining Nazism stoned out of his mind 24/7. He started to really ramp up his stealing and looting of art, valuables, cash, gold, etc. in 1943 as well, while expediting the process of extermination. Thank you.